Nau mai, haere mai, kia ora. My name is Tim, and welcome to the Emerging Futures Summit. This is the first of our, excuse me, expert panels, and my goodness, it's been such an exciting journey to get here. Welcome to everyone from around the world. We have Zahir Ali that is joining us from the US. We have Sarah Cassans, and forgive me if I'm getting the pronunciation wrong, everyone, who's joining us from Christchurch, and Miranda Satterthwaite, again, forgive me, Miranda, but this is our expert panel, and we're going to be looking at the space, what that means, what it's all about. I encourage everyone to make sure you're set up, you've got your headphones in, you can hear us. We are going to be taking questions over the course of the next hour or so. We've got a lot to cover off. What we are going to be discussing today, Carl, if you'd like to just flick us over to our panel discussion, if you can bring us over to there. So again, we're going to be looking at science and mission operations. We're going to be looking at the orbit. How do we manage that as a resource? We've got a whole lot of questions to cover off. But first, I'm going to just ask each of our experts to introduce themselves and just give a little bit of background about who they are. So Zahir, would you like to kick off?
Hi, folks. My name is Zahir Ali. I am a physicist by training. I did my undergraduate work in physics with specialties in electron transport and nuclear particle radiation physics. I ended up moving from school into the Department of Energy in the US, where I worked as a PI and a manager in a variety of different programs, doing mostly applied and science and to national security purposes. I, in the last 10 years, have joined a NASA contract working on the SOFIA program, which is the only flying observatory in the world. It operates out of Palmdale, California. It's run by Armstrong and AIM research centers. And we do astronomy. So I'm very eager to answer your questions and to discuss how the future is going to be all about space.
Fantastic. Cool to hear. Sarah, would you like to go next?
Yes. So I am Sarah Cassans. I'm a biochemist at the University of Canterbury. Sort of how I got here to my current role is I did my undergraduate degree at Purdue University, studying how plants grow and doing some research on understanding sort of the biosynthetic pathways in plants and how that makes them grow strong. I did my PhD at Arizona State University, working on a plant-based HIV vaccine, so sort of merging both plant biology and virology and immunology. And then for the last 6 years, I've been here at the University of Canterbury working on biochemistry projects, looking at biosynthetic pathways and how we can manipulate biosynthetic pathways to make new processes and products for use in medicine and agriculture. I have a little bit of experience with trying to get into the NASA space program. I applied to be an astronaut in the last selection round for the NASA astronaut candidate selection and made it to the top 50 of 18,000 applications. And some of my research now is focused on using microorganisms to recycle bio-waste in space settings.
Fantastic. Cool. And Miranda.
Hey everybody, I'm a STEM educator based in Canterbury. I've worked with our Institute of Canterbury on the Mission to Mars project. Directed that project and the aerodynamics project. Also for youth, I've run a Mission to Antarctica project and have been involved in the Antarctic Forum, Education Forum for some time. I've also worked at University of Canterbury in STEM and working now with Lincoln University. So we've got some incredible tertiaries that support the space industry here in Canterbury, from engineering through to sciences, superfoods. And because of our capacity in this region, I'm part of a New Zealand Centre for Earth and Space Technology, which is looking at evolving and commercialising some great opportunities that come out of our research institutes. So I'm really interested in seeing the sort of things that you can come up with that are new and innovative for space and for the future. We're charting out some great inventions, and we'd like to support you with coming up with some great ideas.
And I got to say, you've got a great jacket on, Sarah.
Yeah, and this is from
Miranda,
Space Camp. Sorry. Totally. So I've taken 36 students from New Zealand to Space Camp. We went to Marshall Flight Centre, we went to Kennedy Space Centre, and then I've been to NASA Armstrong and NASA Ames on business. So New Zealand is really involved in developing its youth, and my background in business and sciences have sort of brought that through to the opportunities we have here now. So
fantastic. Cool. Well, super exciting. I think you all agree with me that we've got kind of three really key inputs into the discussion today. We've got a physicist, we have a biologist, and essentially an engineer with some business background. But again, I think the challenges that we see in space and kind of our big overarching theme of what can we learn from how we explore space to live more sustainably on Earth, that's the question we're going to be sort of chewing our way through. And, you know, it's going to require more than just our three experts. You listening and watching in, you may have a particular angle and perspective on this key question. And again, I really encourage you to get on the YouTube channel and start asking those questions. And I'd like to pepper them in over the course of the hour. So where are we going to start this conversation? I guess I think a great place to start, Zahir, would be for you to just give us a little bit of a foundation and where we're at in our journey to space and kind of where are we heading?
Sure. We are in an amazing, amazing time right now. What you read every day, just last night, here on the west coast of California, we had the privilege of watching a Falcon launch from SpaceX. They launched out of Vandenberg Air Force Base, where NASA has a site, just south, about 150 miles north of Los Angeles. And what a site it was. This is a time that is not very different from the 1960s. We are in the middle of a new space race. But this one is not about intelligence or capability and posturing. This space race is about economies. What has happened is that 10 years ago, NASA estimated the cost per kilogram to get to orbit to be about $23,000 US.
That's a lot of money right here.
It's tremendous. That's per kilogram. So that's 1 liter of water to get to orbit is $23,000, right?
Expensive water.
Very much so. The cost has now come down to $2,200 US. That's a factor of 10.
Wow.
That is critical because by reducing that cost, it has opened the door for robust and frequent space research, exploration, and commercialization. So
a question for me, Zahir.
Yes.
Could I just ask a question?
Of course.
Why is an expansion of research in space so important?
There are many reasons why space research is extremely important to the world and economies as a whole. The reason that we have Wi-Fi, the reason that we have cell phones, the reason that miniaturization happened was due to, in great part, the space race. In the modern world, with challenges that we face, global climate change being one, overpopulation being another, we have to find ways to use resources that are being consumed at a greater rate than they can be replenished or that is sustainable. And by looking at what we could do in space and how we would survive there, we can understand how then to do more with fewer resources and more efficiently here. Because in space, you can't do everything you can do on our wonderful home planet. You have to be extremely efficient with food production. You have to be extremely efficient with energy usage and creation. You have to be extremely efficient and careful with how you use even basic things like air and water.
So
nothing can be taken for granted.
I was just going to say, and Sarah and Miranda, please jump in on this. With that, what space lends itself to be a really good lab for living more efficiently on planet Earth, right? Is that what we're getting at?
Yeah, I think a lot of the research that's directed towards space that happens down in Antarctica is all about the efficiency of energy production in an enclosed environment. Our planet will eventually be uninhabitable in so many places that we need to use the space challenge as an opportunity to improve our views on how we would live on this planet Earth in the future as the climate changes and as the gases change and the temperature changes.
Right. So I guess this is back to our overarching theme of what can we learn from how we explore space to live more sustainably on Earth. The fact that the price of getting up there into the big lab, which is seemingly endless, what we're saying is that it's given us an advantage, right, of actually starting to run more of this research so we can start testing more things around how can we do it more efficiently, how can we live back on Earth, but also how do we get further out there, because there's new things to learn, right? So I guess with the reduction of costs here, and Sarah, Miranda, where are we heading? Like, what does that now mean, and where is the industry taking us?
Well, there are a lot of different things going on right now. Some of the very exciting ones going on are projects like OneWeb, which is aligned with Airbus. They're actually going to put up constellations of small satellites to provide Wi-Fi coverage over the entire globe. So we are going to use space to improve life on Earth. Now, conversely, we are also, because of the very efficient cost of launch now, we are able to launch small experiments, microsatellites, or small biological experiments up into orbit to better understand the effects on biology, or even very simple things like radiation levels at different orbits. So there really and even farther beyond that, there are actually startups looking at asteroid mining and lunar mining. So what's happened is that you now have an explosion of possibility because getting to orbit is not the barrier that it used to be.
What it kind of reminds me, an analogy here, is what cloud computing has done for the software industry, and that, because cloud computing has dramatically decreased the cost of computing power, we now have seen this proliferation of software startups. But I guess in addition to that, just the knowledge of humankind has expanded dramatically, our connectedness. So as a result of this decrease in cost, the possibilities, like you say, have expanded. Sarah, from a biological standpoint, what does it mean for you and what you're interested in?
Absolutely. There's a lot of possibilities that space research can provide, both, again, for habitation for humans in space, but also for life here on Earth. So when we think about sort of the research that's going on in space right now, sort of where we've been in the last sort of 2 decades with the International Space Station, looking at life support. And there's a lot of different areas looking at life support that have been going on in the International Space Station, understanding how humans, how human bodies change and differentiate in microgravity and sort of off Earth. And we've started to understand, the changes in bone loss and muscle loss and ocular degeneration. So your eyesight changes. And so we've had a lot of research on sort of how human bodies change, but then also understanding how we can produce fuel and food and medicine using biological resources in space. So that's sort of where we've been, and also where we're looking towards. And that's a lot of the research that I'm looking at, is understanding how we can support human life in space.
Well, that's fascinating. I guess what, again, with this space opportunity, in my mind, there's two pathways, right? We've got this key question of what can we learn in space to make life on Earth better. But as Elon Musk kind of articulates, his plan B around SpaceX is to give us literally a pathway off. And so when you as participants are thinking about solving challenges, and we're going to get on to some of these wicked questions that we want to kind of test our experts' knowledge and experience on, when you're thinking about problems that you see that are potentially solvable, I think it's worth trying to think about, well, are you thinking about using space as a lab to improve life back here on Earth, or are you actually looking at solving some of these problems and barriers to getting humans, off Earth and further away and exploring, the universe? So we've got a range of questions that we're going to kind of touch on different aspects of that, and potentially we'll get going onto that first key question. And again, I'm going to put this out to the panel, and perhaps Miranda, you want to tackle this one first. Is what do you see as the key challenges to human survival in space? And Sarah, I know you'll probably want to jump in.
Yeah, well, your major issue is obviously radiation, and we are so fragile as a species. Unless we figure out a way to suit up or genetically modify, we're going to find it extremely hard to travel a distance from Earth to Mars. You've got other major issues of propulsion, getting off Earth cheaper, getting from outer orbit to places like Mars, and power supply. How do we maintain a decent power supply for that period of time? And then when we do decide to terraform or land on another planet, the whole issue of habitation and transport and communication on that planet's pretty major. So these things, they're not mutually exclusive to space. A lot of the research that happens in the space industry spins back off on to productive things on Earth. For example, when they're growing algae for space research, some of this has been useful for coming up with infant formula recipes. So it spells a really expensive solution, but the spin-offs from all of these, whether we're talking about habitation, whether we're talking about power transmission, transportation, communication, whether we're talking about how we deal with radiation, they're all useful in terms of technologies back on Earth.
We're getting a little bit of chat here on the YouTube channel around something here you talked about around, is it the satellite company that's putting up satellites for Wi-Fi coverage?
Yes.
And what is interesting is there's a comment here around, what's the benefit of that for farmers? And as you were talking about growing algae in space and getting that knowledge back down to Earth to benefit, local communities, I kind of see this relationship between, we're learning things in space, we got to get that knowledge back down onto planet Earth, using these satellites into remote locations to therefore benefit, communities that perhaps have not been able to connect in with some of this emergent knowledge. And this is where I guess the opportunity of space seems to be, one, interconnected, but somewhat endless.
I think the democratization that you're just picking up on, the one thing about the cheaper, smaller CubeSats that can go into space, they provide exactly that. The democracy of education, the knowledge doesn't just belong to the big players like NASA anymore. If we can use this telecommunication system to educate the masses, then space is accessible to everybody.
Zahir, do you have anything to add to that?
I see it as an extension of the Earth ecosystem, because what has to happen is that, right, what do we see as the challenges to human survival in space? Fundamentally, they revolve around the extreme conditions. And what's happening is that the Earth may itself start to exhibit conditions that, to our relatively fragile biology, seem extreme faster than our biology can evolve to adapt. Therefore, those challenges have to be met technologically. And I think people like Sarah are going to play a lead role in that, because as a physicist, I can design certain technical solutions. But when it comes to understanding what humans need and how to work with what remains of the ecosystem of Earth, that's something that I think the biologists are going to have to take the lead on.
We're working hard on it.
To keep this going, I mean, Sarah, has anyone set up a lab in space that's actively learning? I guess, is the International Space Station an example of a lab in space already?
Absolutely. So that is a U.S. national laboratory, and we've had human presence on the ISS for the last 16 years, which is pretty impressive that we've actually had humans living in space for the last 16 years.
Continuously, right? Like
continuously, yes,
obviously
correct.
a rolling.
Yeah. Yes, no one human person has lived there for 16 years, but yes. So, astronauts from several different countries live up there for a couple months at a time. And so we've learned a lot about life support systems for human beings in space, both for the humans that are up there and for how we can regenerate resources that keep those humans alive. So everything from oxygen to water to food, to how human bodies change. And so for the last 2 decades, we've really started to understand both how human bodies work and how just biology in general works, at least in microgravity, in low Earth orbit. So we haven't had anybody further away than about 250 miles living continuously, but we'll eventually get there. But yeah, the ISS has been a really great laboratory to understand life support systems, like I said, for humans and how biology works. So they've got a really good sort of set of tools up there for understanding all sorts of stuff. Pretty cool, because working as a biologist here on Earth and getting to see the lab that they have there in space, it's fairly analogous. They can do a lot of the same things up there that we can do on Earth.
Yeah, some of that glove box science they do with bioluminescence of bacteria, under microgravity, is the conditions that we just can't really simulate on Earth. It's a microgravity effect on small organisms. It informs a lot for us, ranging from medicine through to biomedical applications. So it's a great resource.
So again, by using space unique conditions, we may get an insight that was previously hidden from us here on Earth. So I guess to just double back around on what are those key challenges to human survival in space, Miranda, you talked about radiation. We've talked about, obviously the human body is an expensive piece of machinery to keep moving, right, and keep alive.
Absolutely. So the robotics solutions to space exploration are obviously the way we've started, and sending and deploying robots to figure out what's actually on planets or what's out in space in terms of chemicals or materials has been the way to go. But I still think it leaves open opportunity, particularly for New Zealand, around material science, for us looking at when we do ultimately send humans, we need to look at how we are going to clothe them or how we are going to protect them from radiation. And it also leaves open the opportunities for when that happens for food technology for New Zealand, how we can grow foods up there, but how we can create superfoods that are going to make humans more resilient to this terrible environment.
So we've got a couple of questions coming in around, what are the new areas of study and that are relevant to space? And I think you've touched on a couple there around new material,
materials technology,
and also
engineering,
and food, right? Nutrition.
Absolutely.
If I may jump in,
of course,
there is one thing that's going to be very critical moving forward is actually. Miranda touched on it, robotics, but one thing that people often forget is that you have a time lag, right? If I remember correctly, it's 4 minutes almost to round trip for information to Mars. So you're not going to be able to, in real time, control a robot. So what that means is that the robots that we do send, systems that we send, have to be intelligent. So right now, we're seeing a very interesting time, not only in the space race, but also in emerging artificial intelligence systems and mixed reality systems. So these two together are going to be
mixed
critical.
reality?
Perhaps
define for us.
Sure. Mixed reality. So you have virtual reality. You put on your Oculus Rift headset and you ride a roller coaster, or you shoot zombies or something. And then you have augmented reality, Pokemon Go. Mixed reality is going to be something like a wearable device, kind of like a Google Glass, where the Pokemon Go is directly in front of you, as opposed to on a screen. So these types of technologies are going to be really critical moving forward, because they're going to enable training, they're going to enable operation. Because you can imagine sending a robot to Mars to do things on Mars and having it controlled from orbit in a Martian from a Martian space station, where we go back and forth before we actually colonize Mars. And some of these systems are simply going to have to be independent. They're going to have to operate with artificial intelligence. And so there is a lot of different areas for every technical discipline to contribute in this regard. And things are going to emerge that we don't realize yet that are relevant.
What about perhaps some of the social sciences, like psychology and some of the softer disciplines around how humans interact and relationships? And again, because you throw us into a small confined environment in space, surely that kind of puts pressure on us psychologically.
Absolutely. Some of the simulations that we put the students through on the mission to Mars in the United States were stressful, and it takes a special type of human to be able to go with only 3 others to a place so far from home and really confined, and go through the gravitational pull and the isolation and the cold.
Right. Is there thoughts, again, and this may be going down a rabbit hole here, but again, there's work being done by a company that Elon Musk is behind, Neuralink, around trying to augment biology. So we don't physically have to travel, but we can travel in another form. And this is getting to the realm of science fiction, but I guess I bring this up because it doesn't seem like there is any limit in terms of the disciplines that are relevant to solving this human survival challenge in space.
No, every single discipline, every type of education that one can gather, and every expertise is going to be relevant. You touched on the humanities. Architects and designers are going to be critical in contributing to how the spaces work, because they're going to have to be extremely multi-purpose. They're going to be extremely small, and you're going to have people living in extremely tight quarters. We have this on the ISS already. Sarah, what would you think of some of these issues, given that you were trying to go there?
Absolutely. So when we think of life support systems, again, we've got to think of it in a holistic way. Obviously, we touched on how the human body changes. So there's obviously physical challenges, but also there are emotional and psychological challenges, just because of the alternate environment that we have up in space. Human beings have evolved over thousands and thousands of years to live on planet Earth. We've not evolved to live in space in the sort of the harsh conditions up in space, and so we really do have to think about both the human challenge as well as sort of the entire challenge of obviously getting off and habitating in space in a very holistic way. And so, like Zahir said, it's going to take all sorts of disciplines working together to solve a lot of the life support and the human challenges off Earth as well.
Good. We're getting a question which is relevant to one of the challenges that the participants are going to be working through around managing waste in space. And I mean, we've got a question here later in our conversation around how do we manage Earth's orbit, which we know is increasingly filled with the waste that, you know, of unloved satellites or satellites that have become redundant. So again, how would someone think about the waste challenge in space from a biological but also a mechanical perspective?
I'll start with the biological waste. So it's really neat, the research, like I said, that has been done thus far on the International Space Station. And so we, on the ISS, we can recycle oxygen. So we can have air to breathe on the ISS. We can recycle water. So basically, the sort of saying is turning yesterday's coffee into tomorrow's coffee. But what they haven't been able to do just yet is recycle biological waste, and so that is a big one, especially as we get further and further from low Earth orbit. We're not going to have organic resources with which to make new foods and medicines. So recycling bio-waste is going to be a really big challenge, and understanding how to do that will allow us to go further and for longer. And so what we sort of have to do is turn yesterday's curry into tomorrow's curry. And so there's a lot of biologists working on that very problem. And it's not an easy problem.
How would someone get started on thinking around that, Sarah? Like, is there anywhere online that people could go or to just start getting an understanding of that problem?
Absolutely. So both NASA and sort of university research and increasingly commercial entities are looking at this very problem. And so I specifically am looking at it from a sort of a microorganism background. How can we tweak microorganisms to basically clean up, toxins and potential pathogens and things that are in bio-waste? And how can we return that biomass into something that is edible? And it's not a very nice thing to think about, but there are lots of people working on it. And so Google searches with NASA and synthetic biology, and some of the, like I said, just understand, so again, just Google searches to start off with, but hopefully we'll have a really good program for that here in New Zealand in the coming years.
It strikes me, again, a question further back from one of the participants was, again, how what we're learning in space is actually relevant back here on Earth. And it strikes me that this very topic is a great one because we've got a growing population. We want to be more resource efficient with the way that we grow and consume and then recycle our food and our food waste. So by figuring this out, because we're forced to do so in order to, travel beyond kind of, I guess, Earth, Mars, and beyond, it also means we can recycle that knowledge back to Earth, right?
Absolutely. And that's a big part of what I want to be able to do. Again, if we can understand how to be efficient in space, we can bring that knowledge right back here and be more efficient on Earth. And so, yeah, this research has implications all over the world and off the Earth.
Just a quick one. Is there any research that says that farming in space is, are the conditions, does it lend itself to a more productive kind of farming process? Has that question been asked or thought about by anyone?
I think if you're looking at farming per metre square, it's got to be more productive. And I think the one thing that space farming, agriculture in space takes the lead on is environmental monitoring. Everything's monitored from carbon dioxide through to water, through to the growth. So when we see this extremely smart farming occurring in a really small space, and similar to the Eden project in Antarctica, we can actually use this to make better use of our crowded spaces, like in Europe where there's tomatoes growing, condensing the farming, so we use less of the land and more of the resources protected.
Fantastic. That's really cool, Miranda. Again, I think that's another example of being more efficient in space means more efficient back on Earth. And I'm going to probably be a pain, but I'm going to keep doing this throughout the chat, is because I think it's really relevant for people to help connect, this world that very few of us will actually maybe get to in our lifetime. But we can travel up there thanks to, again, these startups that are throwing satellites up there. And Zahir, I'm just going to ask a quick question. Are there data streams that we can tap into today from companies like startups that have got satellites up there? Like, are there open data sets?
There are a few. Off the top of my head, I actually, the ones that are government public resources, for example, the United States Geological Survey has an amazing set of resources available that are kind of, different types of maps and things to different ways of looking at the Earth from orbit. A lot of weather satellites are available. On the other side, because many of these things are driven commercially, much of that data is proprietary, and the data itself is the product of that endeavor, not really the satellite. So as we move forward, there is going to be, that's kind of where companies like OneWeb that are semi-commercial come in, and different endeavors. What'll be interesting is if Greenpeace or the Sierra Club get together and start launching satellites to monitor different things like climate change. Right?
So this is where, for those of people that are interested in the social challenge, is thinking about space access from I guess a social enterprise perspective, is how do we democratize access? Because even though the price of access to space has come down, it's still not anyone can send up a satellite, right?
Well, but that's actually the interesting thing, is that you have satellites that are literally the size of a Rubik's Cube now, these microsats. So what is going to emerge, and there are a lot of different people who can contribute in this space, are possibly standardized small satellite platforms that can carry different packages that you as a group, as an entity, may be interested in for socially relevant. For example, George Clooney runs a foundation where he uses space imaging to monitor movement of warlords and cattle, and he warns villagers as warlords get nearby. Now, that is completely a social conscience application of space technology, right? He's saving lives, but he's using space technology to do it. So you're only limited by your imagination.
Yeah, well, it seems to be that's the constant theme here is, it's like there's a giant ocean, and it's not a case of can I jump in? Can I find my place here? It's like, yeah, you can. You just have to let your imagination sort of, go and find a challenge that you want to work on. Does anyone have anything else to add to this human survival question before we move on?
I would just say that, we haven't talked much about the humanities, but I think they are going to be very relevant, because studies have shown that intelligent people, the worst thing you can do to them, the thing that drives them mad, is lack of mental stimulation. Astronauts are tested for this. That is what the water tank test is. And it's interesting to note that the best times have always been performed by women. There's some interesting history there. But how are we going to handle the mental stress of it? Not just from a biological standpoint, but from an emotional standpoint, as Miranda pointed out as well. So I think the humanities are going to have to be part of our solution. Otherwise, we're only, it's human survival in space. It's not biological survival in space.
The human means, our conscious minds, right?
Exactly. Yeah. That's what makes us human.
Yeah. Well, okay. We're going to take a pivot to the next question. And there's perhaps a nice segue for us because there was a question in the chat around how do we harvest water from space, and it was around the idea of how do we take that water and make it potable so it can be, consumed for biological survival. But I guess my mind goes to water is also a great source of energy, is it not? And is that a nice way for us to jump into this question of what are the possibilities for reliable energy systems off Earth? Is water part of that equation?
Yeah, I was going to say, Zahir, you want to take that one? Yeah.
Sure. One of the big challenges is we haven't found a lot of water out there.
Right.
And that which is out there is mostly frozen. So water is a source of energy when you have significant temperature differences or it's moving. So that energy is actually, the water is carrying the energy that is potential energy converted to motion due to gravity, right? So
hydro dams, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Hydro plants at dams. So it's a tremendous challenge because one could ask, are there other things that are flowing on on planets that we could use to turn a turbine? However, with any process like that, it's inherently thermodynamic at some level, and therefore you are limited in a lot of ways.
When you say thermodynamic here, can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
So at some point your heat is involved, and when heat is involved, Carnot of the Carnot engine showed that you're pretty much limited to 30% efficiency. So as we move forward, we have to again break out. We don't need to think outside of the box. We need to build a whole new box in which and think about energy there. Because the old box is the Earth box, and we need to think of the solar system box or the galactic box.
Miranda, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I guess an example of that would be the importance of geothermal activity on Mars and the opportunity that water lies beneath the soil. So, for example, magma drilling, where they can drill down and to the right depth and get energy, geothermal energy out of the ground, is going to be a huge opportunity on Mars. So water may not be able to flow at sufficient speed because of the less gravity there. So we won't be having hydro dams, but the geothermal opportunities using water below the surface are great. So every planet has its own aspects in terms of physical parameters that will limit the use of how we can get energy from water, and that's one good situation for Mars, geothermal.
Interesting. So what you're saying, Zahir and Miranda, is that each time we go to a new environment, we can bring some patterns of what we know from Earth, and then in time from Mars, and then the Moon and various other planets as we move out. But we really have to think from first principles, think again about.
So I guess that's the importance of finding analog places on Earth to do a lot of this testing, because it's a lot cheaper. So, for example, the volcanoes in Maui or around Rotorua, a lot of testing can be done there for astrobiology, and the poles in Antarctica in particular, a lot of testing can be done there of robotics. Our recent space challenge was robotics to do with Antarctica. So I think it's a lot cheaper, and you get a lot of runs and prototypes and experiments over a period of time, then sending something up to space and finalizing that research in space is the way to go.
Okay.
Well, I mean, one thing that I think maybe Sarah can comment on would be things like bioreactors, possibly.
Absolutely.
A complete shift from using the planet.
Yeah, so bioreactors, again, I'm sort of biased because this is sort of my work, but microorganisms can do a phenomenal amount of chemistry. So, I mean, we think about where we got a lot of our antibiotics in the first place. These fungi can produce these really complex compounds Think about like penicillin is a fungal compound. But again, that's thinking within the Earth box. Because organisms can do this complex chemistry, we can tweak them to make all sorts of new compounds, and whether that's fuels, whether that energy sort of thing, or whether that's if we're talking about very simple molecules, water regeneration from some sort of I don't even know. Again, it's using organisms to create new compounds is definitely a possibility, and using reactors, bioreactors, to do so is definitely a possibility, like I said. But a lot of us haven't even thought of.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Kira, but a question I have is, could organisms be used as a source of power, of energy?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, we can either use organisms to create energy, or we think about, again, all of the chemical reactions that are actually going on in organisms. We could potentially harness those chemical gradients to create energy, to create power, to not just chemical fuels, but actually use sort of an ion gradient within an organism, or within a reactor as the organisms are growing. Those are definitely possibilities.
Are there any examples?
I'm not familiar I am not familiar with any personally, but I'm sure there is research going on out there. And even more exciting than the research that's probably going on right now is the ideas that people like you guys out there in the audience will think up. Because again, these things don't exist yet, but they could exist in somebody's head, and all they need is somebody trying them out. And sometimes those ideas are going to work, and that could become sort of transformative technology, and somebody's going to do it.
Yeah. Just to add a couple little things there. What's interesting is the interplay of multiple types of energy sources and processing technologies. So there are people who have experimented with using biologics, lichen, that survive in extreme environments, to process waste from nuclear power plants, for example. So if we ended up putting a certain type of nuclear power plant on Mars, how are we going to deal with the waste? What are we going to do? Well, other people from other disciplines can say, well, we're going to engineer organisms to deal with that waste. So one of the things that I think is really important when thinking about this question is to not stay within our respective, me as a physicist, Sarah as a biologist, Miranda as an engineer, not to stay within our respective silos, but to have the courage and the imagination to link across our disciplines, because that's where these solutions are probably going to come from. That's where we're going to get the leaps and bounds, is through finding these amazing synergies that then lead to emergent technologies and ideas.
I couldn't agree more.
Is it a case of just the more diverse thinking we can get in a room, and just literally brainstorming ideas of connections between things that perhaps, do you do that? Do you get a physicist in the room, and a biologist, and an engineer, and a social scientist, and go, right, here's this problem, let's, like resilient energy,
yes, the
or
best
renewable
companies in
energy.
the world
Do you
are
do
doing
that?
this. Google, right. Apple, all the the Department of Energy in the U.S., NASA, we do this. There's an architect at the table when they're designing.
Fantastic.
When they're doing I forget what the acronym stands for, but it's basically the layout of a mission control area, for example, right? You need to think about ergonomics. You need to think about Six Sigma and Kaizen. How many steps does it take for somebody to get from a critical station to another critical station? All of those things have to come together. You have to have an artist at the table. You have to have a biologist at the table. They do matter, because we're not creating single solutions. We're creating a new civilization out there.
So I guess one thing for you participants to think about is that you're in these diverse teams. You've got people in your teams from different countries around the world, from different backgrounds. And the opportunity for you is to really tap in and harness that, like Zahir, Miranda, and Sarah are talking about, is really see what your diverse backgrounds can contribute to the conversation. You never know that unique set of experiences that you bring to the conversation over the course of the summit actually might spark a new way of thinking that could solve a particular challenge around, in this case, renewable energies. One of the questions that we've got coming in is around, have we found things off planet that we've brought back that have been like a game changer? Like, are we doing that? You've talked about asteroid mining, but is that real yet?
No, we haven't actually mined an asteroid, but we've done some amazing things. A few years ago, right, we landed on a comet. Okay, we've flown through a comet's tail. We're getting close. Those are really hard problems. The telemetry and the control systems alone are 100 times more complicated than what took us to the moon. Incidentally, mentioning the moon, those are really the only things we've gone into space and collected, our lunar samples. But there are programs, NASA is working on this, is the Mars Sample Return project. So this is something that we intend to do, and it's understood that needs to be done. But at some point, what one has to look at, what is the scientific and knowledge value of that sample return versus another probe? To a point that was made earlier about energy, we're going to have to make solutions specified to whatever planet we go to. So we have to go and understand that planet very well.
Mm-hmm.
And so one has to consider whether it is better to put resources into sample returns, or to let commercial industry, which has vested interest in the minerals and other possible resources of interest in asteroids, drive that. Whereas in the national interest or in the global interest, we drive knowledge.
I have a question, and this is for all three of you. Is there anything from the way that humans explored planet Earth, when we were uncovering new land masses and new oceans and new civilizations, that can be applied to the way we perhaps should be thinking about the opportunities in space?
I think New Zealand's got some great examples of, like, our Indigenous people navigated their way here with a limited amount of food in really small vessels in extreme environments to actually be the first people in New Zealand. And I think, we can learn a lot from how Indigenous people survive in the poles, like the Eskimos, Inuit, and how the people have survived on the islands, for how we would survive in these remote places in space. Life doesn't have to be as complicated as we live it in a Western industrialized world. You can get away with a lot less. And the natural ways of growing things and recycling that come from our Indigenous people give them a position to lead the space industry, I believe. It's a great opportunity for learning, and a great opportunity for leadership from our Māori and our Pacifica people due to their natural instincts.
And I guess beyond, right, Miranda, to other Indigenous people around the world, is it may be worth you participants just taking a look at some of your local history around how did people come to survive in some perhaps more extreme environments, and just get a sense of, well, how did they do it? Is there anything that you can learn, which when you layer technology on top of it can scale it out for or solve it in a perhaps even more efficient way. So something to consider there. I want to move on because we're getting close to the hour, and I knew this would happen. We talked about we're going to be short for time, but this is one of the questions that I think might be interesting to the audience. Is we've talked about waste in Earth's orbit, and we've got this question around how do we equitably manage Earth's orbit? Does anyone want to just unpack that as a discussion point, just so we can dive into it?
Here, you want to take that, or you want to?
I can. So, in a nutshell, Earth's orbit has been dominated first by large, wealthy governments, and primarily for military and national security purposes. We are entering an era where that exclusivity is breaking down. We've gone from really 3 nations leading the way into space to now 30 nations participating. India has, in 10 years, launched as many satellites as America did in the previous 40. So countries are catching up. China is planning a lunar rover of their own. So as access to Earth's orbit itself, it becomes more available, how do we think about it? My thought process is that it's a resource in the same way that the airwaves, i.e. the electromagnetic spectrum, is a resource. And every nation has governed that differently, and there are overarching international agreements regarding that. However, this Earth's orbit is not governed by any single nation. So we're going to have to, as a world, figure out how to make it equitable for not just Europe, America, Russia, China, and India, but also for all the other nations of the world.
So I guess, are there any analogies? What's the problem that comes to play if we don't get this right? Like, is it simply people that want to use Earth's orbit to do something good won't be able to because someone's saying no, or there's no space up there?
I think it's not always problems. I think there's opportunities for new technologies and trajectory. It's going to have to be planned, without a doubt. There's also an existing body of knowledge in the law of the seas on how to manage vessels in empty space, or the space is equivalent to the sea. But they're not strategically put in place right across the globe at present. So there's an opportunity for that to be solved.
It's a framework for managing, I guess, in time, not just Earth's orbit, but Mars's orbit and interplanetary space. I don't know. Well, again, I'm kind of charting into territory I have no idea about, but can you elaborate?
Well, as we put more and more into orbit, if one person's satellite runs into another, or they want to use the same electromagnetic frequency to communicate with their towers, who governs that?
It demands a lot more transparency in terms of military, in terms of sharing systems, sharing data systems, so that you've got a lot more transparency around what's going up, when it's going up, and what technology's on there.
What are the challenges there, again, or the opportunities, Miranda, around actually, if we've got people in the summit that are interested in perhaps a non-technical approach to contributing to the space arena, where would you encourage them to dive in?
Yeah, I guess it's all about regulation, getting the regulations right for each country. We're really unique in New Zealand that it's semi-regulated, that it's easy for us to launch. We're surrounded by seas, So that's why our rocketry industry is really taking off. And so I guess communication between nations is what really needs to occur. There's a summit on right now in Germany around aeronautics and aerospace, and hopefully some greater communication comes out of that for planning for this issue.
Okay, all right. Unless anyone's got anything else to add, I think we'll perhaps just end on a question, which is, how might we think about getting to space, and do we want to get back again? This idea of leaving home and coming back, is that something that, as humans, we're quite attached to this planet, and the idea of leaving and never returning seems to be frightening. What are there specific challenges that need to be solved around that particular question?
I would say there's absolutely challenges for that particular question. Obviously, getting out to somewhere, if you want to get back, getting out there is only half the battle. It's sort of like climbing a mountain. Once you reach the top, you still have halfway to go. So there are obviously unique challenges for getting back. Obviously, if you're landing on a different, planetary body or the moon or an asteroid, there's challenges for getting off of that, that particular object. But again, thinking about it from a human aspect, there are more than just physical challenges as well. Being away from our planet, our home planet here on Earth, for longer periods of time, and the risk of not coming back. There's all sorts of psychological and emotional challenges. So to answer your question, absolutely, there's more challenges for getting us back, as opposed to just getting us out there as well.
A one-way ticket.
Yeah.
Those return tickets are always more expensive, right?
Yep.
Look, we've come up on the hour, and this is a chance. We may, if you're all agreeable, just go on for another 5-10 minutes, depending on if we've got any questions from the participants. And participants, this is your chance to really jump on the chat and fire in any questions. And we've got one here from Hari Christopher, and forgive me for my name pronunciations, but the question here is, does zero gravity have any positive impacts on the way that drugs work? Have that change of environment, which we talked about a little bit earlier in the conversation, have we seen things that have surprised us around the way that drugs or chemicals work within the body?
As far as the physiological effects of how drugs work, there are obvious differences, and I'm sure there are positive ones. I don't know specifics of the physiology, and we're still learning. We're still figuring that all out. The more astronauts in space, and the more time that they spend in space, the more they understand that. As far as understanding how chemicals interact with each other, there's a really interesting sort of ongoing study on the International Space Station that looks at that. So one of the things that we do here on Earth to understand medicines and different drug compounds is through crystallography. So basically we take compounds and we form crystals of them, sort of like sugar or salt crystals. And from those crystals, we can then understand what the structures of the proteins and compounds and chemicals are. So actually, we can crystallize compounds much better in microgravity, which is a really interesting one that was definitely a surprise. So we can actually learn a lot about drugs by crystallizing them in space and then bringing them back down here. So there's definitely differences. And that was a sort of surprising positive one that we found, that we can actually get chemical structures of molecules up in space better than we can here on Earth.
That's really cool. We've got another one here around, is anyone doing pollution or water pollution monitoring from space at the moment?
Yes, there are different companies, some startup and others that are commercial, using somewhat older, so they're not paying for flyovers directly in real time, but they're using data sets that are weeks to months to maybe a year old to monitor things like algae blooms, or using what is called hyperspectral imaging to look at different compounds that could be in the water at possibly different depths.
Cool. Zahir or Miranda, Sarah, I'm aware of a company, is it called Planet One, that you can, do they do real time, or they fly over the planet or every part of the planet every day, and they do real time imaging? Are you familiar with that company? And I believe you can get access to some of their imaging for free. Because the extension of that question was around, is any of that information available as open data?
Slightly old information is available at different places. I can't recommend a source off the top of my head, but internet searches should be sufficient to find that.
Yeah. I guess this is always going to be the thing, right? Is, data on early internet was expensive, but as the big pie grows and there is more data and people find different ways of monetizing their operations in space, that data will, I assume, the cost of it will be driven down.
So we had a forum this year, What on Earth, in Wellington, around this use of data and especially smart data for farming and for looking at Antarctica. And this is being looked at the moment in New Zealand, how we can improve our use of data to help biologically, ecologically.
Cool. I've got one question here. I guess this perhaps it answers itself, but space mining minerals in space will obviously reduce our dependence on those resources here on Earth, so we can start to limit our impact on Earth's environment. Is that true, or is there some other consequences we need to think about in terms of going out and mining asteroids or other planets and bringing them back to Earth to use? Does anyone want to jump in on that?
So at a very fundamental level, right, mining a resource ore is raw. Then you have to do things like smelting. So the question remains, where will you do the processing? Right. Oftentimes the mining destroys geography. The processing pollutes. So one could actually even think of it as, are we going to bring ore back home and increase the pollutants into the Earth's ecosystem?
Right.
But it's a double-edged sword, because what this is at a fundamental level is a conversion cost. The same as we're seeing now as we're converting from a fossil fuel economy to a non-fossil fuel economy globally, is that one can say, well, if you have a photoelectric car, or sorry, an EV car, well, what about the carbon footprint for that? But that's a conversion cost. So there's going to be a conversion cost here as well. What's important to keep in mind is that as we develop launch capability, one could also just consider launching waste at the sun.
Right. So actually package it up and throw it off it like at the sun, right. Let it burn up. It's great. Look, we're going to wrap up in the next 5 minutes. There's one more question here, which I think is quite interesting. And this one's aimed at you, Sarah, and Miranda. Are there any unique health problems that have presented themselves from living in space?
It's really interesting when you look at the possibility of weightlessness on the next generation, on gestation of an infant. It's a major barrier. It has to be overcome if we're going to have next generation Martians or people that grow up in space. So our body demands gravity for our bones to be placed down effectively, and it's really exaggerated. You grow a lot taller when you're in space, and if you're conceived in space, you definitely don't grow in a straight line. So, yeah, that's one of the biggest challenges to be overcome.
Yeah, I would.
All right.
Yeah, I would absolutely
jump in there, Sarah.
Yep. So obviously, yes, there's effects of the lack of gravity and effects of radiation, and those have implications for a lot of different physical attributes of human beings who have evolved here on Earth. So like Miranda said, bone loss, muscle loss. A big one that we haven't been able to figure out yet is the change in sort of the pressure in your eyes. So astronauts that have been on long duration missions on the ISS have come back with long-term ocular degeneration. So their eyesight is sort of permanently damaged. So we've sort of mitigated a lot of the bone loss and muscle loss with sort of artificially working out with different techniques, at least in microgravity, at least in low Earth orbit. But the eyesight one is a really big one. Because if we can't figure that out, we've got people walking around blind in space, and that's not really going to work for us.
Yeah,
Wow.
the twin study in space where one astronaut was kept on Earth and his twin brother went to space was really revealing. Also around neurological damage of just 1 year in space, aside from the ocular, the eyes being affected. So yeah, it's a bit of research needs to be undertaken before we send people too much further away than a year and into even lower gravity.
Wow. Okay, I'm going to ask each of you to articulate the one problem that if you were doing this summit, you would jump in and start working on. I don't care who goes first. What's the one problem that if you were doing this summit, you would be working on? And who would you want to have in your team? What are the kind of skills you'd want to have in your team?
I'm going to jump in here first, just because I'm obviously biased because I'm already working on some of these problems. So sort of bio waste management is something that I'm really keen on looking at, and so that's sort of if I were doing this challenge, I think it's a really sort of pertinent one to do as far as sustaining humans in space. And as far as who I want on my team, again, like we've talked about, you want a real holistic team. I don't want just biologists because we all sort of think the same way. I want people, from all walks of life, people, young people, old people, sort of a very diverse group, thinking about, totally crazy off the wall ideas that aren't necessarily biologically driven. And so, yeah, I guess who I would have on my team is a diverse team as possible. Yeah.
Well, maybe you've answered that second question for everyone here, unless Zahir or Miranda, you've got a different take on it. What's one problem that you would both solve?
I mean, the key one of propulsion has had many attempts, so I'll go for superfoods. I think that's really important. We can't survive without food. We need to grow food. We can't carry it up there. And how we're going to sustain life on long voyages between, for example, here and Mars depends on nutrition. So I think for that, obviously, you're going to need a biologist, but the systems around it to support life, a growing life, is going to require systems engineering and also really smart sensing, environmental sensors to keep it alive in radiation. And you're going to need a team that can be realistic about humans only lasting up to 3 weeks with no food. It's going to have to work.
For me, I'll go with something one of my heroes said once. Professor, Director, Secretary of Energy Stephen Chu, at a talk he gave to the physics students at Cal several years ago when I was still there. He said, guys, the three most important issues of your time are power, power, and power. If I had the power, if I had sufficient power, I can terraform the Sahara into a rainforest. If I have sufficient power, I can fabricate oxygen and water out of other elements. So it's all about the power. And who would I want on the team? everybody, every single discipline there is, because we need a paradigm shift. And that is not going to come from restricted thought. It is going to come from having every type of thought we can muster as a species in the room, working on it, trying their best from their unique perspective. And that's really what I think this discussion that we've had brings out in all of us, is the need for diversity, because diversity leads to diverse thought. And that's what we're going to need, because these problems, one of my, another professor told me once, he said, Zahir, all the easy problems are solved. Right? Ampere in his basement, putting compasses around a copper rod, discovering, the way field lines work, that's done. The era of that is done. We are now in the era of big science. It's CERN with the Atlas detector that is the size of a skyscraper turned sideways. We are in the generation of the ISS. We are in the generation of the National Ignition Facility, which is trying to achieve the first sustained fusion reaction ever done on Earth. So it's going to take everybody. It's going to take big teams. It's going to take every discipline you can think of. And it's going to take people deciding that they're going to build their own box, not just think outside of somebody else's.
Love it. I got one question for you. Is how good is The Martian, the book or the movie, at giving people an insight to, like, how accurate is that of a depiction of some of the challenges that that character had to overcome? Like, is it a source of inspiration for people to jump in and think about problem solving in space?
So
there's a bit of growing, there's a bit of,
Yeah,
I think that's a question for all of us, right?
Yeah. I've had a close look at it, and they did everything really, really well. There's only one thing that they got wrong, and I hate to blow everybody's truth, but this is a place with not a lot of air pressure. And in the film, the wind got up so strong that it moved the telecommunications dish and threw him around the planet. It's really not like that on Mars. It's dusty as heck, but it's not that kind of powerful wind. So aside from that, it was a really, really accurate depiction. I'm just not sure he would have got home.
Sarah, Zahir, do you want to add anything else to that? Otherwise, we're going to wrap.
No, I would agree with Miranda. But it's not very, it's not very exciting if, you have just this little puff of wind and he's still standing. That doesn't make for a very good story. But yeah, the rest of the science, I think, was really, really well done. And it makes you think about all the challenges, again, both physically, as far as, habitation, but then psychologically, being marooned off your home planet, not knowing if you're ever going to see, home or your loved ones or anybody for the rest of your life is a pretty challenging situation.
And to talk to the diversity of the rescue team, right? Like there was quite a diverse background of people trying to figure out how to get this guy home.
I just think one of my favorite parts of that, it was extremely accurate. Miranda summed it up perfectly. But I really loved where at the end they asked him, how did you do it? And he said, well, you look at what's happened and you solve one problem, then you solve another, then you solve another, then you solve another, and you just keep solving. And if you solve enough problems, you survive.
Love it.
That's where we are
leave
now.
it there. That's really great. Hey, Zahir, Sarah, and Miranda, this has been great. Thank you to everyone that's tuned in. We're going to get going in 40 minutes for our next panel. So be sure to check back in. This video is going to be up on the YouTube channel. You'll be able to rewatch it. We're going to be taking questions over the next 10 days, which will channel through to our experts and potentially get a few more answers back. So thanks again, and we look forward to having the conversation in Slack and Trello as you start to solve your problems in space. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, guys.